Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Japan is a place I know fairly well. I lived on Tokyo's western edge in my late 20s, and I go back every couple of years to visit my in-laws. I've often thought of it as one of the world's most misunderstood countries, not because it's uniquely inscrutable, but because it's so beset by stereotypes. The casual visitor rarely sees beyond their image of geisha, temples, and anime, but the truth is more complicated and far more interesting. Why does a culture with a reverence for nature concrete over every shoreline and hillside? How did today's repression of the individual emerge from centuries of courtly elegance? Can the traveler look beyond modern blights to find remaining pockets of beauty? I reached out to today's guest because his books explain so many things I found strange about the country, and he opened my eyes to so much more. Alex Kerr is the author of Lost Japan, Dogs and Demons, and Hidden Japan, all three of which he wrote in Japanese first and then in English. He's also an art collector, consultant, and restorer of traditional houses. I think you'll find his insights as fascinating as I do, even if you've never been there. One of the things I find really interesting about your writing is your eye, honed by kind of decades of immersion into Japanese history and arts and daily life. You've said that when you look at the cultural remains of a historical period, you're able to perceive its dominant ideology. Could you say more about that?
I mean, I think this isn't just Japan. This would apply to anywhere in the world.
Right, yeah.
Right. I mean, you look at a Greek temple, and all of those Greek ideals of harmony and balance and Euclid's geometry and the love of the human form and etc. I mean, it's all there, right? And so likewise, the same thing would be true in Japan when you look at these old houses. First of all, the much vaunted love of nature, which now sadly is pretty much out the window. But in those days, when those houses were built, they were indeed one with nature. They had these open verandas, the doors slide open, giving these views of the outside. The gardens, rather than being far away and distant, grand vistas tend to be small and intimate, and you can practically reach out and touch the bushes. The moss and the rocks are, instead of being, as in China, for example, rocks that rise up dramatically and swirl, with holes in them, they're low and set quietly into the moss, which is the Japanese contemplative approach to things, right? And it's built in. Plus, another aspect that's always been a part of Japan, and in some sense still is Japan, unlike other countries, as they quote unquote civilized, they grew away from raw, rough materials. That was considered not civilized. And so things got polished. And that happened in the West. And for example, look at a musical instrument like a violin, the unbelievable technical, even technological elements that give it the perfect tone and the right kind of wood and the varnish and all that. And then you look at something like a shamisen, which is, 3 strings. It's so basic. And that would apply to roofs. You look at the most important roofs of China would be green, glazed with dragons on them and all that. And the most important roof of all of Japan are the thatched roofs of Ise Shrine. So Japan never departed from those things. And it's a love of the raw and basic. And that's why we have sushi, right? Mm-hmm. These are the things that Japan keeps coming back to. And again, that's built into the house. You can see it in the houses, especially in these old kominka. One thing that's very evident is all the beams are nice, polished, square cut columns up to head level. And above that, they're rough, unhewn logs with their bent and twisted, and that's just part of it. And so they didn't try to polish the whole thing.
Yeah, I find it really interesting how this is a reflection of the philosophy too. Like you talked about how in the Nara and Heian periods, you'd see esoteric temples, but then Kamakura through Edo, you've got Zen temples, tea houses. And then in Meiji, railway stations become the dominant sort of great monuments of the time.
Ah, I see I see what you're saying. Yes, it also depends on the era and the age and what the ethos is, and you can actually look at what people valued as their kind of ideal. Uh, and in fact, that's a kind of a sad reflection on modern Japan because everything's built out of concrete and plastic, and sadly, that is now the ideal.
Yeah, yeah. You said it's the pachinko parlor represents the modern. That's pretty interesting.
Well, I call it the victory of the industrial mode. And it really finally conquered after the World War II. And the idea that wooden that these things I was just talking about, the wood and raw materials and thatch and low key blah brown and gray things, those were considered beautiful. Now they're considered old fashioned and out of date and not progress. And so what you want is bright, flashy things, and that's advanced. So Japan finally, in a sense, gave in. Well, ironically, the rest of the world, or at least certainly in Europe and America, we went the other way.
It's interesting. I see this in other places too. We lived in Malta for several years, and it was only foreigners interested in the old Maltese houses, the old stone houses. Everybody else wanted these new, modern blocks of flats that were just horribly built, where everything broke. So
Yeah.
all these abandoned houses in the village core, beautiful houses with traditional archways and made of stone, were just left empty.
Now, there is some reason for that when it comes to residential architecture, which is that as they were built and as they have been lived in, they are completely impossible for modern people.
Mhm.
We are not
Why
going to live.
so?
Well, because they're go as much as I love these Japanese houses and I've devoted my life to them, if you told me that you've got to go and live in one of them like the old grandparents do, I couldn't do it. They're freezing cold, they're hot in the summer, they're filthy dirty. The dirt rains down from those ceilings because under the roof tiles is dirt, you
Uh,
know. The bathrooms are horror stories. I mean, horror movies, it's just nightmare. There's it dark, there are no windows. There are all kinds of things that make it unfeasible for modern life. Said, does that mean it's hopeless? You just tear it down? No, they can be. That's really been my mission is to show that these things can be brought into the modern age very beautifully, and that in some ways Japanese architecture lends itself better to the modernization process than the Maltese houses.
hmm.
You know,
How
I mean, for
so?
example, well, for example, I studied at Oxford. It's right. I studied Chinese there, and my room, or as they would say in Oxford, my rooms, although it was one room, was 500 years old, and the wall was 3 feet thick, solid stone. You couldn't put a pipe, an electric wire through that. Everything was tacked onto the surface, looking literally tacky, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In Japan, where it's basically this framework with practically no walls. Practically, you can run things under the floor, above the ceiling, behind a column. You have a lot more flexibility than you would in some rigid, massive stone structure, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So actually, Japanese houses lend themselves to it.
That's what struck me about your description of the Misaki houses, this blend of kind of modern convenience with traditional
Yeah.
aesthetics. Before I forget about these dominant ideologies, what about Jomon?
Well, of course, the Jomon people lived in holes in the ground, which had a sort of they put a sort of a thatch covering above it. Um, Jomon is really mysterious, and I trace Japan's really wacky side, the manga and the anime and the over the top uh, weird and wonderful. Even the really wacky things that we find in something like kabuki, uh, which is incredibly inventive. And of course, the ultimate example of it might be Buto, Buto dance, paint themselves white and do these kind of grotesque movements. Those things could only come out of Japan, and I think they have very deep roots. And so when you look at Jomon pottery, it's really outlandish,
In what
right?
way?
Oh, it's got these flames kind of coming off of it, and there's kind of bits and pieces stuck on here and there, and odd misshapen is a sounds critical, but they're weirdly shapen.
Mm.
They're not just sort of nice smooth vessels. They're covered with all sorts of stuff, right? And then the images of gods, we think they're gods, are, you have women with many breasts, but then beards, right? Heads in the shape of a triangle.
Mm.
I mean, they're very peculiar looking, fascinating. I mean, what Jomon is actually, I think, undervalued. It needs to be better appreciated in the world as one of the world's great extraordinary efflorescences of creativity because it's so just unexpected and kind of weird, really, from our modern point of view, weird and wonderful. And Japan was producing those things 50,000 years ago.
That's what's so interesting. It's not something that people would think about in the context of Japan. Anybody who doesn't know it.
Well, that's because nowadays, when people think of Japan, it's also polite and everybody's sitting in a brown kimono with their hands crossed in their lap in the tea room and all that. But there's a weirder, more, in a sense, magical, stranger, far stranger Japan that goes way, way back, and that actually still shows itself in the arts, in Japan's distinctive creativity. Japan comes up with things that nobody else does, and consistently, and I think it has those roots.
Yeah, this is one of the things I find most interesting about your writing is how you link these aspects of centuries old traditional culture to modern trends to show that how those same elements are playing out in modern times. Like, for example, you refer to instantaneous culture. You've said that while Chinese poetry might go from mountain landscapes to grand ideas, that Japan's poetic forms focus on the mundane moment, that there aren't any long
Yeah.
narratives.
But again, that's the same love of the raw and the simple and the rough. So, in other words, that emotion, that raw emotion, that feeling you got in that instant, that's what you're just like you're looking for the raw taste of the sushi or the thatch on the Issei roof. We don't want to start polishing it and complicating it and adding decorations and doing all this other stuff to it. Let's get to that basic raw thing. Japan does it all the time, even in literature, right? It's actually amazingly consistent.
Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about this too in relation to kabuki. You said that its dramatic unity and narrative structure might seem weak, but instead it emphasizes the depth of a single instant to create this atmosphere of intense excitement.
Yes, which is why traditionally, nowadays they've been kind of infected by watching a lot of Western opera and so on. And so at the end, they clap. In the old days, when I started watching kabuki, there was never any clapping at the end. They shout on the spot when something amazing happens. You hear these voices in the audience, you know. Uh, so it was instantaneous. And the other aspect that I love about the kabuki is that it's because it's not tied necessarily to a very formal dramatic structure, they can make these outlandish leaps, just completely unexpected, fantastical things happen just out of the blue. They're free to do that.
You've also talked about the way that kabuki's themes provide insight into Japanese society. For instance, you write many plays are about the relationship between a lord and his retainers, or that between lovers, but there are none about friends.
Rarely. There's a little bit, but it's rare. A huge amount about love affairs, yes, which I guess would be true of maybe plays practically everywhere. But an enormous amount about the loyalty to the house and to the lord.
Hmm.
For example, in China, there's quite a theme in Chinese opera about lawsuits.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they love that, and people then pleading before a judge and all that kind of thing. You never see it in Japan. That's not a Japanese or hadn't been in the old days, a Japanese social concern.
Well, this is a great quote too. You've said that the muffled scream of the individual being strangled by society is psychologically what these tragic kabuki loyalty plays are all about.
Oh yeah, because the blue-clad Sarariman that's working himself to death and that can't openly express any opinions within his company and is just leads this downtrodden life. So when he goes to see a kabuki play where someone is sacrificing their own child for the Lord, That's what he's done every day of his life. So it's moving.
So did this repression of the individual always exist, or was that a consequence of the cultural shift from Kyoto to Kamakura?
Well, it's the war. It's basically you essentially put your finger on it. It's the warlord culture, right? Military culture, which but I would say that the full impact of it wasn't fully felt until Edo, at which point things got very standardized and rigidly managed. And Japan became at that point fully bureaucratic. uh, and the hierarchies were solidified, in a very severe form, and it really set in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You see this rigidity in so many areas today. Like the school system is a good example. How it's designed to just hammer in conformity, and the ability to suffer and endure.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Suffering is very virtuous. In Dogs and Demons, I've basically you could sum up that whole book, Dogs and Demons. By the way, the subtitle is The Fall of Modern Japan. You could sum it up by saying they couldn't change because that rigidity has meant that Japan's unable to shift to new paradigms. So the world is moving on, but Japan is stuck in its old ways. And that's why the educational system, field after field, Japan's not been able to make that leap. One example that really struck me recently, I was reading, how is it that J-pop, which everyone loved and which started the whole trend, was eventually left in the dust by K-pop? How did that happen? Well, one of the reasons was it turns out that the Japanese music producing companies depend on CD sales. Can you believe it in this day and age? They're still selling CDs. And so they were terrified of just putting the Koreans put stuff up on YouTube, which was free. Let it go. And that, of course, then hit the sweet spot, and then the whole world listened. Japan was still stuck in selling CDs, which was a dying business, even at that. But they couldn't let it go, and so K-pop conquered, and that's happened again and again in field after field. So Japan has been reliant and sort of stuck on things that had once succeeded and were no longer succeeding, but the system can't change. And that's back to education. Remember that extreme rigidity and everybody follows the rules and arrives on the clock and leaves on the clock and listens to loud spoken announcements and does what they're told. That's great when you want obedient factory workers. And they got obedient factory workers and became a very wealthy country. Now you want creative people and people who can do startups and people with imaginative ideas about software and et cetera. And also you need in civil society people that are going to run NGOs, people that are going to be involved in the environment, and all these creative fields. That is hopelessly inadequate for building up that kind of a person, right? Yet the system can't change to adapt to that. So they're still producing uh, unimaginative, complacent, and obedient people. Well, that's dragging Japan down as the rest of the world leaps forward.
One example of that, I think, is in manufacturing and in factories. Like the word has fallen out of my head for the Toyota's famous method of incremental improvement. Kaizen. But you said the downside of Kaizen is that it doesn't involve negative criticism. You can only suggest positive improvements.
Yeah. A, you can only suggest positive improvements. B, it's incremental. So, in other words, let's say that you have a certain technique and it's working in a certain way. You say, well, we'll polish that a little bit and we'll change something here, fiddle with it, and make it a little more efficient. Whereas what you actually need is somebody, the paradigm breaker, who comes in and says, let's discard that system altogether. There's another system over here that we haven't even looked at. Let's go with that. That can't happen with Kaizen. So why did not only Toyota, but all the Japanese makers fail to build EVs? For the reason that the music people clung to their CD sales. They didn't want to do EVs because it would eat into their existing car business.
But at the same time, aren't they having success with hybrids? where some of the EVs over here in Europe are failing.
Well, that was the thing. It's hybrid is actually a kind of a Kaizen. It was like kind of doing an EV, but not, right? And it worked for a little while. But actually, what the world wants is not hybrids. They want full-fledged EVs, and that was clear some time ago. And that's why, you've got the Chinese are now stepping in, and the Japanese are not at the front of that parade at all. They really lost time. And again, it was because they were not willing to let go of what had been a successful business, but was not going to be, in the future. So imagine Tesla came from nowhere. They didn't have the resources of Toyota or any of those Japanese car makers, but they conquered because the Japanese wouldn't do it. Now there's this rush to catch up, but in the meantime, Tesla and the Chinese are so far ahead of them that it's going to be.
Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to ask you too about filmmaking when you brought up J-pop. Like there was a period where Japanese films were such an avant-garde hit, like the Kurosawa and Ozu and all these people. They don't seem to be taking off now. It's Korea again is dominating films, at least over here.
Again, yeah. Now that there's a couple things going on here. One is that Japan filmmaking also became very cookie cutter and completely complacently relying on redos of series of things. I think they did Toro-san 50 sometimes.
Yes, yeah.
And also the Japan film industry kind of stopped relying on actual people in films, and it became highly reliant on anime, right? And in anime, they've had some amazing success, right? But when it comes to films with actual people in them, there hasn't been that much of interest. So that's one aspect. But there's another aspect which goes a little bit deeper, and that's got to do. I wrote a book called Another Kyoto. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, I haven't seen that one.
Well, you should take a look at a chapter in there called Shingyo-so, which talks about the 3 levels of formality, which the Japanese made into one of their philosophies. And so a tea ceremony, you can do one of the 3 levels, and the way you do the flowers and calligraphy, everything comes in these 3 levels. And so the first level is everything is in its place. Like when you do calligraphy, each line and each dot is put in. The second level is a little bit freer hand. The third level is just a completely abstract shorthand, right? Those are the 3 levels. But it can also be, for example, representative art and impressionist art and abstract art. And of course, the tea masters decided that they were going to be the third, the informal level, which is back to these crude, rough, natural things. So they said they then connected that to China and Korea. So they said Chinese art, which has these perfect, noble shapes and gorgeous, polished glazes, elegant, refined, noble, that's China. And then over here in Japan, we're rough and crude, and with bamboo baskets and thatch and tea, the tea ceremony ceramics, which just look like burnt lumps of clay. That's our aesthetic, and that's actually higher than the Chinese aesthetic. They turned it all on its head, right? But it became the Japanese kind of default, right? But then there was this thing in the middle, which was Korea, which was sort of like China, but rougher, and sort of like Japan, but a little more free-spirited, right? And Chinese ceramics, Korean ceramics, which the tea masters adored. I mean, they were originally what were most used in the tea room in Muromachi were Korean ceramics because they had this roughness and it felt more human. It was the humanity of it. So if you look at those 3 modes, right? The Korean mode, it's sort of like the Goldilocks principle, right? Too hot, too cold, and just right. So the Korean mode for the world is just right. The Japanese are a little bit too stuck in their Japanese modes to touch on universal human chords. The Chinese are at this point off the scale because of their dystopia has just, but Korea hits the sweet spot again and again. And of course, they copy Japan, but then they modify it and they bring in this. It's very human and very warm and very funny and all these things that the Koreans are really good
Yeah,
at.
that's interesting because we often get Japanese films here at the Berlinale or at some of these festivals, and we always go to see them. But it seems like the pacing is off for European audiences, right? Like if you don't have any experience of living in Japan, you just don't get.
It's a little too slow, too formalized, too. But let's go to the other side of the picture. When it comes to contemporary art, it's Japan that has conquered. And so it's and it's because they went for that third rough, primitive, abstract level, right? And that's what the world seeks nowadays in contemporary art. And so they don't want to see something with covered with blue and gold dragons. That's China. And the Korean is just a little bit too crude, but the Japanese has this distinctive thing, which is they take these rough and crude elements and then they create something of incredible polish and sophistication. And that combination is irresistible in contemporary art. So in that field, Japan really won the day.
So, in speaking of this repressed individualism, I was surprised that this was not always the case. Like you talked about discovering this insight through art collecting, that individualism and irreverence were evident in older works of art. Like you mentioned a little bit with the Jomon period as well.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that the final, even through Edo, as hierarchical and systematized and everything as it was still pretty wild and woolly. First of all, it was broken up into 400 feudal fiefs, and they all had their own types of culture and different sorts of food and even different dialects. The educational, for the very reason that the educational system was still pretty basic, most people wouldn't have gone past a sort of sixth grade level, although they were highly literate. So Japan had the world's highest literacy, but they didn't go through the kind of cramming and university exams and institutionalized regimentation of the educational system. Each village had their own way. Each teacher had his own way, right? It was so people learned different things. They spoke different dialects. They lived in parts of the country that had no communication with other parts of the country, right? And the lower classes, which is to say the farmers and the townspeople, because they were sort of powerless and unimportant, they were granted a pretty free hand, and they could do what they want as long as they didn't cause trouble. And so you had this efflorescence of the great Edo period towns, the brightly colored kimonos and the kabuki and the screens and the festivals and all this stuff that was pretty, some of it pretty wild. Japan has these naked festivals, all these sorts of things happened, right? Some of the roots of that goes back before Edo, but it was allowed, and the authorities didn't concern themselves so much with it, right? So long as people paid their taxes, Come Meiji, and especially post World War II, the technology of it changes. You're now able to have printed textbooks that everyone in the country reads, and on the same day, you have ministries that enforce these things, right? Regional dialects are dying out. Everybody's watching the same television and same television channel. And so the ability to homogenize and flatten it all out and make everybody see and know and do the same thing has dramatically changed. And so, yes, I think it's creating a different society from what we had in Edo and certainly before that.
You've described this as the law of no surprises, I think, being a guiding force of Japanese life, like that no society's ever gone to such extreme lengths to rein in spontaneity.
Yes, and certainly, and especially in modern days. But of course, the tendency to that did exist from way back. A tea ceremony is highly scripted. And in a tea ceremony, so-called conversation, the questions that you ask and the topics that will be discussed, and even the form of the language that you use, all of that is prescribed. Even the language and the conversation is a kind of a dance almost, and everyone has to know the choreography.
So you've talked, well, I've been lost in that situation. I went to, attended a small, just kind of a demonstration tea ceremony at Hiraizumi. And my wife and brother-in-law
Yeah.
were there, and they were as lost as I was. We didn't have a clue what we were supposed to do. But you've talked about the same tendency in ikebana.
I, I should I should just throw out one thing. We do these arts programs where we teach foreigners and some Japanese also about the traditional arts. And in the tea ceremony, the first thing you learn is not how to prepare tea at all. It's how to be a guest.
That's fascinating.
There's just there's just as much technique that goes into that as into actually making the tea.
So you've talked about ikebana also as an example of how rather than use flower arranging as a way to respond to nature, they tried to exert control over every branch and twig.
Well, now again, that's a modern distortion. And so flower arranging had been a way of responding to nature.
So what time
And
period?
well, from Muromachi onwards. Flower arranging, as we now know it, Ike no Bo and all that, kind of really got going in mid Muromachi. And it really, and that's when and the early flower masters wrote treatises in which they said, we are expressing the cosmic laws of the universe are being expressed through these shapes, right? And they, of course, it's a combination of something that's very natural and also something man-made, to create a certain bend of a certain branch to look even maybe more beautiful than nature might have been, right? So it's uh, but as Edo progressed, they then started to create manuals of it and show you that something should go off to the left and the right and so on. But it was still pretty free and easy. And it was still very much left to the mood, the creative attitude of the flower arranger, until again modern times when a kind of manualization mentality has set in with everything. And you'll find signs in restrooms and things, directions of 5 steps how to wash your hands. It's amazing. So when it comes to flower arrangement, it became rigidly manualized, and so the modern flower arranging books literally have angles, 63-degree angle in this direction and 72 angle in that direction, and people assiduously copy that. And that is so far away from what those original flower masters were talking about.
It's also so far away from the image that I think outsiders have of Japan, especially you see it here in Germany, and the French have this the opposite image. And I think they would be especially surprised at the efforts that Japan goes to control nature, like these concreted hillsides and those goddamn tetrapods all over the coastline.
Yeah, well, there's all that, and then sadly the most recent thing that's happening that it really breaks my heart, and other people, including a certain number of Japanese, are trying to resist and fight. But there's a kind of an anti-tree turn, and this is unusual in the developed world. Trees are now, there's quite a dogma and a propaganda about it. Trees are wasteful and dangerous. And so this is across Japan, old trees and tall trees are being cut down. And you can see it in university campuses and on streets and in any kind of public space, public parks, shrines, temples. And it's pretty widespread and picking up on momentum. And so the idea that trees are dirty, that's another big thing because they drop leaves and things. So trees are dirty and dangerous and also economically wasteful. And those three arguments are pretty strong. I would say that's now become the mainstream. And it's tragic. And there's been a great, the big case where this kind of came to head recently was the so-called outer park of Meiji Shrine, where there's a long line of ginkgo trees. And then behind it, there were like 1,000 old trees, or 100 years old, over 100 years old trees. The city's going to redevelop that area and cut down all of them. Not the line of ginkgo trees; those will remain. kind of, but they're building the new buildings going to add are so close to them that very likely they'll be damaged too. But 1,000 century uh, old trees are going to be torn down in Tokyo. Now, the good news is that there was a big outcry, and Japanese civic groups have raised signature campaigns, and people are fighting this, which in Japan's pretty unusual, right? So there is some hope. It does look like the city will eventually just cut them down, wait it out and then cut them down. But that's just the tip of an iceberg. Every day of the week, I see, especially big trees and old trees, they're the enemy. They're getting cut down.
So bizarre.
None of this fits the Western idea of Japan as this country that loves nature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've never experienced hay fever before until I lived in Tachikawa, and I've had the worst hay fever of my life there because of this.
Yeah, it's because of
monoculture.
The tsugi trees, which are a complete financial and ecological disaster. But again, that was about, why should we have these wasteful, primeval forests? Let's build something more useful. And of course, they made a massive mistake there because they planted low quality wood that nobody wants, can't be sold, can't be used. So the whole thing has been a disaster in every way.
Yeah. I can't believe that trees are considered kitanai. Is it the leaves falling or something?
Yes, leaves are dirty.
Jesus. Yeah. This concept of kitanai is the bane of my married life, Alex. I have to say, this is a minefield of bizarre taboos that I walk through every day of the last 22 years. Yeah. The worst is soap bubbles. Have you encountered this? Like, I do the washing up after dinner, and if there's a slightest bit of soap bubble left on a dish, my wife just loses her mind. Bubbles, it's kitanai.
Oh my God. Wow. Okay. Yes. I haven't run across that, but no, it's a big, and of course that attitude of purification, so to speak, is something that's deep in Shinto, and that's why you purify your mouth and hands when you walk into a Shinto shrine. And most of the Shinto ceremonies actually have to do, in one way or another, with purification. So that's a cultural attitude that's deep. But one of the points of Dogs and Demons was that these cultural attitudes, which are actually highly beneficial and beautiful in some ways, and have essential value to them, once that met modernism and then were transformed into this sort of Frankenstein, and it became something else. And that's the problem with the trees are dirty and this cleanliness fetish. Japan's had a huge decline in outdoor activities. The Japanese go swimming, skiing, or walking in the forest or anything else because of germs. Nature is dirty. And this is pounded into kids, right? And so again, it's such a distortion of something that was quite philosophically beautiful in Shinto, right? So these things are twisted in their modern form.
That's really interesting. It also activities like that seem to be just reserved for old people. Like, I used to go hiking a lot when I lived in Tachikawa because Okutama was just a short train ride away. I could go and get a map, and hike up one mountain and down to a different train station and come back in a day. And it was such a great thing to do, but I would only see old people there.
Well, yeah,
just big groups of old people too. Like I would tell my students, what did you do on the weekend? I went hiking. Oh, how many in your group? I'd say just me. Oh, kawaisoni. They're so sorry for me.
Yeah, well,
but it just seemed like young people weren't really doing those sorts of things.
They're not. They're really not. And so there's been a big fall. For example, the ski slopes of Japan are very successful and busy these days, but it's the foreign skiers.
Yeah.
Not the Japanese. And beaches all around Japan. There's been a huge decline in the number of people that go swimming at a beach. Yeah. So all of that is part of this germ sort of fear of nature and dislike. It's actually turned into a sort of dislike of nature, all of which sure doesn't fit the way people believe that Japan is. And the way all you have to do is change is to was.
Hmm.
So it was a reality that Japan was close with nature. And it was a reality that Japan loved nature and loved old trees and all of these things. That was once true.
Well, this is speaking of that. Another thing I found interesting and surprising about your work, you said that the self-pitying perception that Japan, punished viciously by the elements, is a hard place to live in, is drummed into people in so many areas. And this is the reason for controlling the hillsides and the shorelines. But I'd always kind of accepted that without giving it much thought. But you present really interesting comparisons. Like Italy has
Yeah.
volcanoes and earthquakes far more severe, but they don't fixate on impermanence or.
Yeah. Exactly. So Japan certainly has its share of disasters, as um, the Fukushima tsunami. Well, it wasn't just Fukushima, the whole Tohoku tsunami. The recent, quite terrible earthquake that we had in Wajima, right? And in fact, in Hidden Japan, where there's actually a photo of this the lacquer house,
Yes, yeah.
gone, burned down.
Gone. Oh
Well,
no.
Wajima was just hugely struck. I mean, not only Wajima, but the other thing, another photo that's in that book is the old port on the west coast of the peninsula. I've been hearing about that, half gone,
Wow.
fallen down. So Japan definitely has these things, but so do huge other parts of the world. America's got tornadoes and hurricanes, and, all of these things, right? Volcanoes, even for that matter, and Europe, plenty of that too. But people haven't focused on now that could be to some degree something that came out of Buddhism, the idea that life was ephemeral, you know. Um, that might be why they focused more on it.
Yeah, there's such a fixation on safety. The daily life is filled with peril, and so much is abunai. You just hear constantly these announcements all the time.
Danger, danger. Yeah.
Every time I wanted to do something when I go over there, everybody tells me how dangerous it is to go hiking alone or, winter hiking or whatever.
And that's hurt Japan because now far fewer young people want to live abroad or study abroad.
Wow.
There's actually been, and that goes against almost every other developed or even undeveloped countries in the world where there's been a massive increase in youth travel, in years abroad and study abroad and all of that kind of thing. Not to mention massive numbers of Chinese and Indians and Vietnamese and so on coming to America or Australia or UK to study. There's been a big drop in the Japanese that study abroad or even travel abroad. And that's kind of runs against the grain for the rest of the developed world. And I think it has a lot to do with the idea that you don't want to do anything that's might be a little different because it's scary and it's dangerous, and so I think young people are a little bit afraid. If they're not fearful, it's like too much trouble. It's a bother to deal with these difficult and maybe dangerous problems when you go abroad, and so they'd rather not. And so Japan suffers from that at this point because they don't have so many internationally trained professionals, whether it's medicine or and certainly engineering and many other
Hmm.
fields.
Yeah, that's surprising. I didn't know this about this trend. It seems like when you meet travelers, it seems like it's one of two extremes, at least previously. Like there's either the group tour where they do a sanpaku to like Vegas, LA, and like three cities in 3 days and then sleep on the plane, or you meet these maniacs, absolute Japanese maniacs who are bicycling to Tibet or something just on their own, There didn't seem to be a middle ground.
And of course, no, there was. I think there was always everything in between, but there's a huge decline in all round. And big travel companies like JTB are very worried because what they found is that people that travel repeat. They love it and they continue to travel. And so what you can't expect is the people that didn't travel in their 20s are suddenly going to start traveling in their 40s or 50s. They probably won't. And so they're concerned about what's coming. They can still kind of survive off the older travelers who started traveling when they were in their 20s. but there's a new generation that isn't traveling. And that's already impacting Japan. There was somebody from Harvard here a few years ago, and he was saying that there are scholarships for Japanese students at Harvard that are just going empty.
Wow.
Yeah, because they don't apply. They don't have enough to who want to study at Harvard. Can you believe it?
That's amazing.
Can you imagine scholarships for Vietnamese or Indians going empty?
Wow. But at the same time, you seem to see the opposite trend now. Like it just seems like uh, foreign tourists are flooding Japan these days in places you just don't expect to see them.
Oh, the opposite has happened, and Japan has had a tourist boom. In fact, someday, I don't know if I'll ever do it. I want to put out the kind of the follow-up or kind of updated version of Dogs and Demons. And there will be some chapters that will have to be changed and rewritten. One has to do with the finance world and the collapse of the bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, I think it was 2 days ago, the stock market reached the high point of 1989.
Wow.
34,
Yeah.
30, almost 35 years later. So we're 35 years later, and okay, now they can put that behind them. So those chapters would be more relegated to history and be less of an issue today. The other chapter that needs to be rewritten is the one on tourism. Because when I wrote that book, Japan was nowhere. It was 30 something. It was behind Croatia and Tunisia. And, Japan was nowhere, just not on the world tourist map. And now they're one of the most visited and most want to be visited countries in the world. We went from, in the early 90s, it would have been about 4 million a year. By the 2000s, it was 8 million a year. And now it's 30 million a year.
Wow.
And it will soon, I think within a year or two even, or shortly anyway, it's going to climb to, it'll be double, and it'll be 60 million.
Wow.
So Japan is an extremely popular tourist country, and it's being overwhelmed, actually. Kyoto is just rush hour on the Yamanote line at this point.
Wow. Well, how much of that has to do with exchange rates and costs? It always in the past, it was just so expensive to travel there. And now it doesn't seem as much.
Well, a couple of things happened. One is Japan is poor. It was something that I'd written about in Dogs and Demons and foresaw coming. And indeed, in 1989, at that moment when the stock market reached its high point, Japan had beaten America and actually had a higher per capita GNP than the States, which got everybody furious. And they were, campaigning against the Japanese buying Rockefeller Center and so on.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, well, fast forward, Japan's not now in the top 20. Ireland is ahead, and Denmark and Singapore and certainly America. America's GDP is well over double Japan's per capita. Australia might be 3 times, which means that Japan's in the near future definitely not going to catch up either. It's about at the level of Italy, actually.
Wow.
Which is not terrible. So Italy is a reasonably wealthy and comfortable place. So Japan's not somehow suffering and miserable, It's not a poor country, but it's definitely not one of the world's rich countries. So the standard of living is cheap. So just in general, forget about the exchange rate. Just what things cost, even for Japanese, has remained stable. You can still get a 500 yen bowl of noodles or something, and that's been true for 30 years. Prices didn't change, right? And then on top of that, we've had this amazing drop in the yen.
Mm-hmm.
So we're now at 150 yen to the dollar, whereas just a few years ago it was 100 yen to the dollar. So that's a 50% drop. Amazing. So Japan got poor anyway, and then combine that with the yen drop, it means that for foreigners traveling here, it's quite a good deal.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And not just for Europeans or Americans or something, but the Thais and Southeast Asians and Indonesians and all that, it's now affordable.
Wow.
And they're coming in great numbers.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier now, too, I find. like as a foreigner getting around, when I was living in Tachikawa, if you can't read kanji, you don't know where you're going on the train. Like the rail map was all in
So
Japanese, and
they've adapted very much. There's a lot of English language signage. The Japan's made quite an effort to become a tourist power, really. It's a national imperative. The government is by their big budgets behind it. They'll support this in various ways. There's a lot of PR campaigns. So and there's a lot of focus on making it easier for people to travel. And one thing about Japan is that basically China, which had been the tourist destination, has really removed itself. So China is now fundamentally closed for all sorts of reasons. And one thing that I found fascinating is this year there was a 92% drop. Isn't that an amazing number?
wow.
In the foreign package tours to China, which is that's like close to 100%. What that's saying is nobody is traveling to China.
Mm.
So with China removed, who's left in Asia, right? Well, you have Thailand, Korea, and Japan in East Asia, and to some degree Vietnam, and they're all benefiting, right? So Thailand goes on, being an enormous tourist draw. Korea gets actually an awful lot of tourists, more than you'd think, but Japan is the one that first of all has the cultural richness,
Yeah.
right? And people do want to find out about tea ceremony and wear kimono and go into a Zen temple and see old ceramics and experience old houses and all this kind of thing. And you can do that in Japan. And that's part of the enormous draw within Asia.
Mm. So where do you see it going?
Plus, I see it only increasing. I think Japan is, there will be no slowing down of the tourist boom. And so my concern is actually not trying to sell Japan or get any more people to come to Japan, because they're going to come anyway. It's how do you deal with over tourism,
Yes, exactly.
which
Yeah.
is and so damaging, and it can be managed. There are ways to manage it, and I actually wrote a book in Japanese, unfortunately, only called, the English title would be "Destroying the Nation with Tourism," and it's not because I'm anti-tourism. I'm in favor of it, and I think that this is good for Japan in all kinds of ways. And not only the money, but it's opening a window through. A lot of fresh air of new ideas is coming in from the world because of the tourism. So it's good for Japan, and is certainly the last hope for villages like Ia Valley, right?
Yeah.
So tourism is the only thing that will save Ia. So I'm all for it. That said, like any industry, there are side effects, and you can manage it. And so that book actually just talks about management techniques, traffic, access, reservation systems, et cetera, et cetera. There are all kinds of ways to do it, which sadly Japan is not doing. But if they did, they could absorb. I think they can absorb 60 million. After all, when you look at France and Barcelona and these Venice or whatever, per capita, they're absorbing far more than Japan. Not that they're well managed either, but the point is that they do get those numbers and somehow survive. So Japan can do it. I just hope that my focus is on tourist management at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the problem. Everybody wants to go to the exact same places.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how do you control that, or how do you manage it so that you don't damage those places? And also so that it remains a good experience for the people that do go. And it's starting to happen around the world. I mean, the Acropolis now has daily limits.
Yeah. Venice as well.
Machu Picchu and Venice charges, I think, €10, maybe €8 or €10 now to, enter Venice unless you have a hotel reservation. There are all sorts of ways that you can. In fact, and Venice is talking about it may finally have restricted the huge cruise ships from entering,
Yeah,
right?
after that one
Because they
smashed into the pier, I mean, that's probably a good
well, that
idea.
was just the least. But the cruise ships bring practically surprisingly little economic benefit because people can drink and sleep on the cruise ship. So what happens is they tramp through town and take photos.
Yeah, yeah. That's something we saw in Malta quite often too. Yeah. Just a massive disgorgement of people, and then they vanish instantly and leave nothing
So the
behind.
numbers look good, and the bureaucrats can say we got 20,000 people, but it didn't bring in 20,000 people's worth of actual income.
Yeah.
And Venice understood that. So that again is another issue that I talk about in my tourist book, which you've got to look not only at just numbers, how many people came. Let's look at instead of that, let's look at how did the community benefit and what were the costs of it as well, right? And then you want to shift to different modes, longer stays, right? You want to get away from tour buses that disgorge a lot of people that just come for 10 minutes and go away. That's actually brings amazing little
Yeah.
benefit.
So what impact do you think this will have on the aging society? That's the big concern in Japan and Europe.
Well, I think the aging society will go on aging and Japan's population will go on declining.
Will they solve it through robotics or some interesting? Because they've rejected the notion that Europe is trying with this mass immigration that's causing so many problems here.
They're not going to go for mass immigration, and the robotics. It's so limited what robotics can do. And remember that's back to the factory mode.
Mm,
And Japan's idea of civilization is, big mass producing factories. But the economy of Japan, even Japan itself, is not based anymore on that, or not. It's not. That's not the majority of Japan's GNP by a long shot anymore. Service industries, including tourism and including software and all these other things, and robots aren't going to be able to do most of that or a big chunk of that. A robot's going to bring you tea in your ryokan room or something. Maybe they will, but I don't know how well that's going to work, and certainly not soon. And the big population crunch is already upon us, and is growing increasingly severe year by year. And so it'll be a long shot before robots can solve that.
so what do you think will happen? It just continued population decline and economic decline?
Yep. Uh, Economic decline may not be so bad if Japan develops these new industries, like the kind of tourism that's now developing, right? If they can start to make paradigm shifts in their various industries, because Japan has certain great strengths, right? They have these very powerful, well-established companies with their own research divisions, and well-funded universities are not very efficient, but they're well-funded in some ways. So, yeah, I'm not so pessimistic about the economy declining any more than it already had. Remember, it already has declined or stagnated is the right word. So Japan's economy didn't go down; it just remained level while the rest of the world went up. That's what happened, right? Um, and a nice, comfortable stagnation seems to be something that the general public doesn't mind at all.
Interesting, yeah.
So but the decline in the decline of rural districts is drastic, and I think that huge numbers of them will just disappear. I see they're already disappearing. I see it happening, and so there, the few places that did do something about sustainable tourism and did maybe restore a few old houses and tried to kind of focus on protecting their natural environment, they'll survive. The others that built the road and the dam and planted some more sugi, they'll disappear.
So then this is one of the core themes in Hidden Japan, where you're looking beyond these modern blights to search out places where people can still connect to this deeper essence. So you describe that as a search for the ura, the back, whereas most visitors to Japan,
Yes.
as we've said, are just seeing the emote, the kind of bucket list places. So could you explain that sense of ura and emote?
Well, Udo and Omote is one of those things that's built into Japanese uh, traditional life and philosophy. And it has a lot to do with Buddhism, with esoteric Buddhism. And esoteric Buddhism, esoteric is a fancy word for just meaning secret. What that means is when you see those Buddhas with many arms and hands and all the iconography, you as a normal person cannot immediately penetrate that. You need to study it and to go through um, different stages, right, of your understanding until finally you penetrate into these inner mysteries, right? And the idea that there are inner mysteries and that what you see on the surface isn't really it is built in not only into Shinto, but into Buddhism, but deeply also into Shinto. And so that kind of attitude that the surface, that what you see on the front side, the obvious thing that you see is not the deep thing, is it's built in anyhow. And that's certainly true when it comes to travel nowadays, where you can cram in your thousands to see the gold pavilion, and you're going to get very relatively little out of it. And that's not a critique of the gold pavilion, which in and of itself is one of the world's wonders, no question. But still, the way that it's managed in the presentation and the fact that it's just seen as this object to take a photo of, that makes it this kind of surface experience. You go to one of these villages that I talk about and spend a bit of time there, and you breathe the air of those forests, right? And you see what it's like in the rice paddies, and you go into one of these old rustic temples with the pine trees whispering around it, right? Then you're now penetrating to this deeper thing, this Ura.
You've said Shinto is nature before the hand of man has touched it, and Buddhism is civilization. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, that's obviously very rough generalization, but yeah. So Shinto is very much about those primitive things I was talking about earlier. Thatch and stones, I mean, sacred trees, right? Sand. The sand gardens, which are in Zen, actually come out of Shinto. So the origin of that is in Shinto. For example, Shinto traditionally had very few actual images of gods. They do exist, but they're not shown. They're usually hidden in a shrine. So when you go to a shrine, you don't see a statue normally. Every once in a while it happens, but it's rare, right? And what you see is usually nothing, or maybe just a mirror, the ultimate abstraction, right? And so Shinto is about invisible. The gods are an invisible presence, and they don't make efforts to show them in some physical form, right? And again, that's a very primitive animistic thing, and it's also very powerful because of that. Whereas Buddhism came with civilization from Korea and China. And so you get these magnificent, complex temples with gorgeous lacquered finish and gold hangings and complicated Buddha sculptures and the sutras filled with umpteen kanji that are read in ancient, extremely complex ways. All of the sort of the marks of civilization, right? And so that there's this contrast. And Japan very adeptly does both of them. So they both exist, and they crisscross. So there's a lot of Buddhist elements that got into Shinto. So Shinto is by no means some kind of pure primitive thing. And there's also an awful lot of Shinto that got into Buddhism, including, for example, those Zen gardens.
Yeah, that's something that surprised me, that you said that they coexisted originally, even on the same property, the Shinto shrines and temples. I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, oh yes. Well, when Buddhism came in, as Buddhism typically does, I think in most places where it goes in the world, it was very open to just accepting the local religion, and they did. So Shinto was already here, and that's fine. But they had this question: how are we going to combine them? Right? How do these two things mix? And they came up with this ingenious system called Honji Sui Jaku, which means original essence and descended traces. right? Which is basically saying that if you have a Shinto god, it's the local trace in Japan, but the original essence is this Buddhist um, bodhisattva or Buddha, right? And they connected them all. And so for every important Buddhist god, there is in that system a bodhisattva that it supposedly is descended from. And so what happened is that the Buddhist monks ran most of the Shinto temples, shrines, and it was all intertwined. They ran the Shinto shrines, but while doing Shinto ceremonies. I mean, it's
Mm.
really remarkable the degree to which they mixed, and it remained that way right up until 1868, when the government mandated a divorce, and temples had to be just a temple, and Shinto shrines had to be Shinto shrines, and there was an enormous destruction done. Literally, possibly tens of thousands of temples were destroyed across Japan. And enormous numbers of artworks were burned and hacked up and destroyed. And you can every once in a while see traces of it here and there at certain places in Japan. And so that was an extremely destructive period. And ever since then, they've been considered totally different. And modern Japanese also would hardly be aware that it had once been a unified religious world.
And you said Shinto was rigidified or sort of controlled in was it the Meiji period? But it was very different before. Like what were the differences?
Well, also part of this process was that they made Shinto the national religion, and they lowered. Buddhism had been primary and had controlled most of the Shinto shrines. Buddhism was now relegated to something secondary. Shinto was the national religion, and there was a government ministry in charge of it. And so once the cold, dead hand of the government fell upon it, then suddenly every Shinto shrine in Japan had to recite the same prayer, had to have an altar with the same way of presenting things on it, had to wear robes that were similar. Whereas previously, the Shinto shrines had been quite a mix, right? And some of these traditions were very ancient. There were also traditional families, some of them in their 20, 30, 40th generation, who were kicked out, and some sort of basically Shinto bureaucrat was sent in from somewhere else to replace them. So it actually not only damaged Buddhism, but it also damaged traditional Shinto in many ways.
So did the practices themselves also change at that time? Just became
Yes, yeah.
standardized, basically. So what sort of variety would you see before?
Oh, all kinds of. They wore different types of robes. There were many different variety in the prayers. There's traces of it still. Now um, when people pray at a Shinto shrine, right, they clap twice. But for example, in Usa Hachimangu and in Izumo, which are among the oldest pre-Issei, they're the real Ura, right? Because they're older than all that. They clap 4 times. Yeah. And so that remains still. They resisted the systematization. And Omoto, where I studied and worked for years, which is a modern Shinto religion, but they do the 4 times because they were going back to that antiquity. So things like that survive here and there. And there are also some shrines and temples in Japan that still retain that mixture of Shinto and Buddhism within the shrine or within the temple. There are a few that that kind of reverted to that after the pressure relaxed, really after World War II.
That's really interesting. So, to come back to this Ura, you said that your purpose in writing Hidden Japan was to offer readers a sort of a treasure map. Follow the clues and you'll know what to look for, you say. Lush natural forests, rough carved stones, and the rest do still exist. But nowadays you need an extra stock of knowledge to seek out what's real. With that knowledge, when you find the real thing, your joy is tripled. And when you don't find it, there's a satisfaction in understanding what you're looking at. So how should somebody like me, someone who visits Japan every couple of years, go about accumulating some of this knowledge?
First, read Hidden Japan. um, you accumulate it by keeping your eyes open and using your common sense, and you'll quickly see it's obvious that you're not, if you've got a bunch of trees lined up in straight rows, you don't look at that and go, oh, primeval nature. It just isn't. It's clear. It isn't. So what is it? Then you might ask, what is that? Right? And that would apply to so many things. So part of it is just more and more experience, travel a bit more, try to find the Ura, travel to it more, take more time when you travel to it. Because one thing about Ura is that it takes time. It's not something you can take a photo of and you've got it, right? You've got to breathe it in and let it wordlessly impact you, right? And so that's another thing that I'd recommend to travelers is that you don't need to see five places, go to one or two. Just settle in and let it and allow yourself to feel it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good philosophy of travel in general, I think, for any place. So let's end by describing one of these unique places from the new book. Like I was
Hmm.
especially interested in your wanderings in Tohoku because that's the region where I spend the most time. But I'm just going for envy in this. And could you tell us about Aogashima? Because I saw a photo of it 8 or 9 years ago, and I've wanted to experience that place ever since.
Well, Aogashima is just astonishing. It's this small, tiny island, hundreds of kilometers south of Tokyo, in the middle of the Pacific, and it's a volcano, and it's a double-coned volcano. So when you see it, and with very high cliffs all around it, so it's almost inaccessible. There's one little port and a little windy road that takes you up and then through the cliff, and then you're into the center, where there's that other another cone in the middle of it. It's been inhabited for a very long time, and it's it's part of the Izu
Mhm.
Islands, which go for there are quite a few of them stretching down south of Tokyo, Yokohama, and the Izu Peninsula. And actually, they all belong to the city of Tokyo.
Yeah, that's very strange.
Yeah. So you're on this tiny island that's it's pretty much on the same latitude as Miyazaki in Kyushu. So it's very far south, but the license plates say Shinagawa. There are only 100 some people living there, and it's always not been many living there, but it's part of there had been a tradition of exile for criminals who were exiled to islands, and the Izu Islands were one of the places that they went, and this was one of the islands they were also sent uh, over the in the Edo period.
Mhm.
But
That's
the
a very
most
difficult place to get to, huh?
Oh yeah. So the thing about Aogashima is it's really hard to get there because there's you have to fly to Hachijojima and then get a ferry, a several hours ferry south down to Aogashima, and the ferry only leaves about 50% of the time. And then when the ferry gets there, if the waves are high, they won't dock. You have to turn around and go back to Hachijojima. There is a helicopter, but it seats like 8 people who are mostly locals, so you can't get a reservation. And so getting there and getting back is really a challenge. So it is not a place that many people have traveled to. And I managed to do it because I was on a committee of the city of Tokyo. And so they facilitated my getting down there. Otherwise, it's just rough. But it's the people love there. It's a little unusual in that it hasn't had a big population drop. The
That's
locals
really
love
strange. Yeah.
yeah, the locals love their island and want to live there. And it also has a tragic history, which I wrote in some detail in the book, in
Mhm.
mid-Edo when it blew and the volcano blew up, and hundreds of them died, and they had to escape, and then there was this saga of how did they get back, to their promised land, and so that's quite a tale, and that's burned to them this idea that their island is precious and somehow they got back to it, and so they're going to stay.
And like all places in Japan, they have their own unique cuisines, and I think so. They have a unique shochu, right?
Yeah, they have a very unique shochu it's done with a certain leaf, a kind of a fern that grows uniquely in their forests, and on that fern is a certain mold or fungus, and they put that leaf in the fermenting process, and somehow that mold gets into it, and it creates this really distinctive taste.
So how would you
So
describe
yeah,
the taste?
it's got a little zing to it, is what I would say.
Mm,
Yeah. And
mm.
it's a kind of a gourmet item in certain specialized restaurants because they don't produce much. And the other thing that's unique about the island is that many of the brewers are women.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Really unusual in Japan, where it was almost like a taboo vocation for women in the old days. But in Aogashima, and
Why?
many
So
of
why
the,
did this happen?
well, it was a tiny island. Maybe the menfolk were out on their boats or something. I'm not sure why it happened, but you can imagine how it might. And the brand names of many of these shochus have some woman's name, the grandmother or the auntie or something. Yeah.
So what about distinctive dishes from Aogashima?
Well, I wouldn't say the food is all that distinctive. It's just good seafood, Um, but so it's not a food thing so much. The other thing that they have their own type of drummers. They
Oh
have their
yes, yeah.
yeah, they have a drum corps. Yeah. Oh, yes, there is one other food item that I mentioned also in the book, which is their salt. Yeah, the bit of land that's around the internal cone is actually still steaming. And so they use that steam to evaporate the sea salt, the water from the salt, and they produce also a very distinctive local salt that steamed, and because it's been steamed in the steam from the volcano, it also has a unique taste. And that's another gourmet item that's exported to Tokyo.
Well, I guess that's where we should leave it. So thank you, Alex, for your time today. I've learned so much from your books, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for ages. It was an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.